So today's topic is wormholes, and we'll be trying to clear away some of the confusion about this idea today, and hopefully avoid adding any more confusion to the mix. This will not be easy since we can't discuss general relativity in too much detail. As I mentioned back in episode 1 of this series, you need an awful lot of math to actually see the genuine explanation for how these things work. The non-math explanations and analogies you probably already know. If you do have that math background, I recommended Leonard Susskind's series on general relativity at the start of the Faster Mind series, and I'll recommend it again now. Like any of the video links you'll see today, you can just click on that to pause this video, and watch that, and come back here and unpause this one when you're done. But in this case, since that series is several hours long, I would suggest finishing this one first. Since we can't do the math, I'm going to just talk about the types of wormholes, of which again there are a lot, and the various categories of them, and some lesser known neat things about them. Categorization tends to be arbitrary, but here is our list of topics for today. Number 1. Basic concept of wormholes. Number 2. Non-traversable wormholes. Number 3. Traversable wormholes. Number 4. One-way wormholes. Number 5. Two-way wormholes. Number 6. Intra-universe wormholes. Number 7. Inter-Universe wormholes. Number 8. Exotic matter and wormholes. Number 9. The Casmir effect. Number 10. Naked singularities. Number 11. Quantum entanglement and wormholes. Number 12. Travel time in wormholes. Number 13. Time travel using wormholes. And number 14. Other uses of wormholes. Everybody knows what a wormhole is, in terms of basic function. It's a gateway from one place to another. We often represent this in science fiction as a circular-mouthed tunnel that after some time gets you to your destination at the other end of the tunnel. Incidentally, we usually would refer to these as the mouths and throat. Some wormholes are one-way, in which case only one would technically be a mouth, but obviously we are not going to label the other mouth for a one-way wormhole with the anatomically correct term for that digestive analogy. Now we can't go into the math of wormholes, but I can answer some misconceptions and questions that often come from those who don't know the math. For instance, we usually represent wormholes as 2D gates, or mouths, in science fiction, but a naturally occurring one ought to be a sphere. But it doesn't actually have to be one, and a lot of models for making these things artificially with exotic matter favor the more 2D version as being way cheaper on exotic matter. We've discussed exotic matter before in the series, and we will review it later on, but it's generally required in most wormhole theories to permit you to use them for travel. Similarly, when we show models of these things where it shows two flat grid planes connected together by a tunnel, the throat, it makes people wonder if you could exit midway through. But you can't because there's nothing to exit through. It's easier to visualize, I think, as a balloon where you've poked it with a finger in two separate places and kept pushing till your fingers met. Only that's still basically 2D, and you can imagine sneaking outside the rubble. Same as you picture the entrances to each end of a tunnel as 2D. There's nothing to sneak outside to though. These aren't subway tunnels or elevators cutting through space-time where you watch them whiz by faster than light on some straight line between the two mouths. The throat of a typical spherical wormhole in a black hole example is actually a sphere of space inside the event horizon. So a wormhole does actually take time to traverse. They are not instant, and we'll look at that more later. Sometimes, conceptually, it is easier to think of the black hole variety as more like the layers of our planet: crust, mantle, inner and outer core. The crust being the event horizon, and the mantle a vortex-like region the way down. The throat would then be the outer core, and the narrowest part would be the shell at the edge of the inner and outer core. Your ship can't be bigger than that. And not all wormholes have to be a single tunnel either. Some versions allow multiple exits, and for that matter, one of the new theories regarding Hawking radiation is that it gets out by a lot of individual wormholes. Later on, we'll look at a new theory of growing popularity that contemplates the idea that particles that are entangled with each other might be connected by tiny wormholes. Wormholes also don't have to be the same size, no more than the mouths of a classic tunnel have to be, but you can only send something through that's smaller than the throat, or it will be ripped apart, Same as a train slamming through a tunnel that suddenly narrows. It's just more three-dimensional rather than the long chain a train can be, since only its cross-section matters for passage. You also can't stick anything through a wormhole that is massive, or more massive, than it is, or you're going to destabilize it. Destabilize, in this context, would usually mean releasing the majority of the wormhole's mass outward while a smaller portion collapses inward, which is essentially a supernova. Obviously, if the wormholes weren't very massive, this wouldn't be as bad, but unless we're talking about some of the ultra-tiny kinds of wormholes you might use for just sending signals, or tiny fast streams of matter, you wouldn't want to be in the same solar system when one exploded. You wouldn't want to be near the smaller one either, but at least then we're talking about booms of non-planet destroying varieties. Now there's tons of types of hypothetical wormholes, and quite a few of the naturally occurring versions are ridiculously tiny and hanging out in the quantum foam. Often the idea is to take one of those and expand it, or that they might have naturally expanded as the universe expanded. We'll talk about that a bit more when we get to the Casmir effect later on. Before we move into our second topic though, let me just make one point. Wormholes are incredibly theoretical, and there are tons of different models. So a lot of times you'll get stuff about their behavior that sounds very contradictory, and that's because it usually is. Each model is different. We'll be sticking to the ones that decently follow from General Relativity today. You can go nuts trying to keep them all separate, and unfortunately, a lot of folks I know with intermediate knowledge on this tend to make the mistake of locking down on just one version, and tend to be guilty of saying, no, that's not how it works, when there's actually plenty of models where that is how it works. Okay, so topic 2, non-traversable wormholes. This is pretty straightforward conceptually. It's a type of wormhole you can't pass through, either because the throat collapses before you get through, or from a more practical standpoint, one that would just kill you trying to make the passage. This arguably includes any wormhole with an event horizon, and basically any black hole. The original wormhole concept, a Schwarzschild wormhole or Einstein-Rosen bridge, is one of these, and trying to find a wormhole that isn't is obviously the goal. Einstein and Rosen were trying to avoid a mathematical singularity, essentially the dot-like point of infinite density at the center of a black hole, which these days, with better computing power, we generally think is partially wrong anyway, with concepts like singularity vortex sheets, and nobody took the solutions that spawned the notion in the mid-30s too serious until John Wheeler screwed around with it in the early 60s and pointed out such a wormhole would collapse almost instantly. I should probably remind everyone at this point, when we talk about the interiors of a black hole and use comments like very quick or almost instantly, that time runs at an absurdly slow rate inside a black hole. Time does not stop when you fall into a black hole, not past the event horizon anyway. It just keeps getting slower and slower as you go deeper down. For you, assuming you were falling into one of the really big ones at the center of many galaxies that don't have the tidal forces so strong they'd shred every atom of your body before you got inside, you just fall like normal from your perspective. It would be very fast since you're accelerating fast, but to an outsider who can't actually see you anymore, but magically could for our analogy, your trip would seem to take longer and longer as you fell. So a fast event inside a black hole might only take a second of internal time, but take eons externally. But in a nutshell, a non-traversable wormhole is just that, one you can't traverse. You can take that very narrowly to mean just those for which nothing can get through, even a photon or particle, or more widely to mean one where it would just kill you trying, even if your particle has exited the other side. Traversable wormholes, topic 3, are the ones you can pass through. Most versions of this involve using exotic matter to keep the throat open so it doesn't destabilize, and again we'll look at that more later. It is usually considered to be a lot of exotic matter though. The Morris Thorn wormhole called for about 100 million suns worth of this stuff we've never found a single particle of, while the Visser wormhole only requires a modest Jupiter-sized amount of it. Incidentally, you will sometimes now hear the Morris Thorn wormhole called an Ellis wormhole, or Ellis drainhole, since more recently it got noticed that H.G. Ellis and K.A. Bronikoff had both independently figured out the concept in 1973. It's the same thing in this case, so Ellis gets the credit for first figuring it out. So Kip Thorne loses the credit for discovering it first, but still gets the true accolades because he got the notion of traversable wormholes back in circulation in the late 80s, and shortly after that a lot of other versions were uncovered from the renewed interest. I'd give similar credit to Matt Visser, though, as one of those early enthusiasts after interest got renewed. Thorne and Visser opened the door that made it both an interesting and respectable field of speculation, and simultaneously opened the door for an awful lot of wonderful science fiction, including two of my own favorites, the Stargate franchise and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I know some folks like to argue the Kirk versus Picard issue of who the better captain was, but for me it always goes to A.V. Book's portrayal of Benjamin Sisko, especially after they let him shave his head and grow a goatee. So with the door open, we got a lot of versions of wormholes that might work in this or that cosmological model, including some that didn't require much or any mass at all, exotic or mundane. Of course, those also broke down into one-way versus two-way wormholes, and raised the question whether they exited into our universe or a different one. Topics 4 and 5 are pretty straightforward then. Some wormholes are one-way streets, so if you want to go back you need a separate wormhole nearby the first one's mouth. Stargate went this route, though they let you shut off and dial back to the original place, or any other destination in the catalog they had an address for. They also let you send signals both ways, and I never understood the justification for that, beyond the importance of it for plots needing conversation through the thing by radio. The original basis for that is probably the idea of black holes connecting to white holes. A white hole is the exact opposite of a black hole in that you can't push anything inside, whereas in a black hole you can't push anything outside. The original concept for this out of the Einstein field equations was that a black hole was a future state and a white hole emerged from the same black hole in the past. This is just one of the many time travel things that comes up with wormholes, as a concept we'll discuss later on too. Those versions did actually attract matter just like normal, but nothing could actually get in past the event horizon. It was also proposed that white holes would be in another universe, something we'll get to shortly, or were outright creating one, acting as a big bang inside the core of the black hole that spawned a whole new space-time, a concept you'll have encountered in many sci-fi stories. It's retained a lot of popularity among physicists too, though it's not the sort of thing you can actually prove. As I recall, it first hit popular culture in the 1979 Disney film The Black Hole, and the year before as a cameo in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The idea fell very out of favor after Stephen Hawking proposed the idea of black holes evaporating rather than being eternal objects. This was actually a few years before those came out, but the ideas take a while to percolate. This is the big one-way wormhole option though, since you can't go into a white hole and you can't go out of a black hole. Nothing would stop you from making a second pair near each other, and backwards of course, and wormhole networks, especially the Roman ring, are something we'll also get to. Two-way wormholes, our fifth topic, simply includes any you can go both ways through. That probably doesn't require any more explanation since it was the one-way variety that we really need to talk about. A big thing on these is that you can generally see them, or see the other side. By default, it would look like a warped snow globe of what was on the other side. Now, topics 6 and 7 are the idea of intra and inter-universe wormholes. An intra-universe wormhole opens up somewhere in our own universe, and is thus handy for travel. The default wormhole of fiction is an intra-universe, two-way, traversable wormhole. It has the big advantage of letting you get around your own universe quite quickly. It has the big disadvantage of raising the specter of time travel and the associated paradoxes we discussed back in episode 2. More on that later, but this is the ideal wormhole in most cases. Topic 7. Inter-universe wormholes. These are ones that connect to two different universes. This first emerged in regard to white holes and the original Schwarzschild wormhole or Einstein-Rosen bridge. These are generally one-way wormholes too. If you've ever seen the 90s sci-fi show Sliders, this is what they were sliding through. I don't remember what specific handwave they were using, if any, for why this always opened up on Earth and a close parallel of our own society, rather than randomly dumped into space or at a big bang, but it should be noted the idea isn't necessarily confined to many-worlds quantum interpretation of alternate timelines. It could just be another universe, totally unrelated to our own. There are a ton of different multiverse options kicking around, much like wormhole theories. I do like this one, and let me emphasize I like it, not that I think it is firm science, because it is an option for getting out of a dying universe, and one ironically related to where life would probably hang out near the end. A couple weeks ago, we did the Civilizations at the End of Time first episode on black hole farming, and I pointed out two things there. that once the stars go out, your only power source is black holes, and that one of the ways to tap black holes for power is to leech off their rotational energy until they stop spinning. Schwarzschild wormholes, the original one basically, derive from solving Einstein's field equations for a black hole that is not charged and is not spinning. Solutions for rotating black holes, or charged black holes, or both, came later. They also predate the idea of Hawking radiation as eternal black holes, and Hawking radiation remains totally theoretical and has a lot of critics who still favor the eternal black hole notion. It's the big strike against white holes too, and the idea of them opening into new universes. A civilization looking to tap those black holes can use the rotational energy to live like kings for a very long time, until the black hole stops spinning. If it can't live on the Hawking radiation after that, either because there is none, or it's just too low and slow to keep your civilization together, you will have a non-rotating black hole sitting in front of you. I've always thought there was something poetic about the notion of just jumping in to check firsthand if black holes did lead to other universes at that point, since you've got nothing to lose. Of course, you'd have at least a quadrillion years before you need to check that hypothesis. I have a soft spot for suicidally brave actions, too. As a side note, folks were asking me after that video about maintaining those structures for timelines that made 1 trillion years look like an eye blink, and I said at that time I have no idea how anyone would. But something that came up a lot is proton decay, the idea that even protons might have a half-life. They might. When I was in school, we thought it might be 10 to the 30th years. It's been pushed up to a minimum of 10 to the 34 or 35 years more recently. But under the standard model, it doesn't have a half-life, and that's a prediction of grand unified theories, particularly SUSY or supersymmetry, along with magnetic monopoles, which also still haven't been observed. I don't think supersymmetry is dead, even though it's been declared that in a lot of magazines in the last few years. But it's certainly taken some hard blows from predictions of it not panning out, especially at the Large Hadron Collider. One of the big purposes of the Large Hadron Collider was to help check supersymmetry, but another is to hunt for exotic matter, which leads us into topic 8. Now, we've talked about exotic matter before, specifically imaginary mass and negative mass. Exotic matter is a fairly loose term. Some would include dark matter as an example, but I know some folks who strongly disagree, presumably because to them exotic means rare, which dark matter certainly is not. I generally view it as having exotic properties compared to what we know. Either way, with wormholes it usually means negative mass, same as when we talked about warp drives last time. The purpose it serves with wormholes is to make the throat stable so it doesn't collapse. From a strictly conceptual standpoint, you could think of it as a rafter shoring up a tunnel. In practice, it's usually a thick or thin shell of the stuff down under the throat in the black hole version of the things. It exerts a positive gravitational force, repulsive rather than attractive, and that can keep the throat open. It's also the way stable and naturally occurring wormholes might arise, since naturally occurring exotic matter could have taken primordial and tiny wormholes and widened them with time. Quite a few physical theories tend to figure there's trillions of little wormholes blundering around everywhere. The Morris Thorne or Ellis wormhole, on the other hand, is huge, in order to use a black hole whose tidal forces wouldn't shred a human apart. We talked about that more in the black hole duology of videos, but bigger black holes are a lot safer to be near, ironically. In this case, they have a mouth several hundred astronomical units across. That isn't arbitrary, and was selected specifically for survivable tidal stresses. So you could go a lot smaller, but this one needs something like 100 million stars worth of exotic matter to hold open. That generally means it's the sort of thing you'd build at the center of galaxies to connect them to other galaxies, or maybe have a handful in one galaxy at most. The Visser wormhole, on the other hand, aims for a mouth about a meter across, and needs a Jupiter mass worth of the stuff. Visser also offered an alternative to ramming headfirst into exotic matter, which would generally tend to be fatal and possibly destabilize the wormhole too. Visser usually has this as a polyhedron, whose struts are full of the exotic matter instead, so you can just go in between them, and again, way smaller, just big enough for a person to squeeze through, but that's enough. Truth be told, that's a lot more than enough. You could presumably go way smaller, so your wormhole's mouth was only big enough to pass a laser beam through and have communications as a result. That's in the range of mass where we could conceivably have one orbiting a planet like a communication satellite and doesn't require planets worth of mass, exotic or mundane, to build. And from a transhumanism perspective, if you can send data, you can send people. For those of you trying to figure out what the most plausible artificial wormhole about would be, I would say, and just in my opinion, that Visser's polyhedral wormholes are probably the best. I'll attach his 1989 paper on it in the video description. It's actually only 7 pages long, and the math is in there, but I think you can still get a lot out of it even if you can't follow the math. Now, for the longest time, exotic matter, and the unreality of it, was probably the big thing preventing folks from researching wormholes more, as they appeared to be something that couldn't be traversed even if you could somehow survive a trip into a black hole, because the tidal stresses and concerns of slamming into mass. But there are some ways to arrange the geometry of mass-making singularities, like making a spinning ring-shaped black hole, maybe by putting a lot of smaller black holes or neutron stars into a Klemperer rosette. More importantly, we have gotten good indicators that exotic matter, or something with the characteristics of it, might exist somewhere other than in theoretical models. Which takes us to the Casmir effect. In the classic example, we take 2 conductive plates and stick them just a few billionths of a meter apart, and we suck out all the air in between them and around them so it's a vacuum. There's no field, so nothing should happen, but what we observe is the plates feeling some force between them. This can be either attractive or repulsive, depending on how we arrange the plates. Now, this wasn't experimental. Hendrik Casmir predicted this in 1948. Trying to prove it, trying to make 2 large, smooth plates barely an atom's width apart but still not touching, is obviously kind of tricky. The further the plates are away, the weaker the force should be. It wasn't until 1997 at Los Alamos someone managed to pull this off with any real certainty, and actually using a sphere and a plate instead of 2 plates, and it got nailed down even better in Italy in 2001. Until then, no one was really sure this was happening. Theory, no matter how good, is always very iffy until you've got experimental data. Now, prior to that, there was already plenty of notions for what might cause this mysterious force between the plates, but vacuum energy was the one generally considered most interesting. The important thing was that you could generate a negative pressure. Now, a negative pressure is a fairly straightforward concept. We use lower or higher pressure all the time. Heck, the whole point of an airplane wing is to ram through the air at say 10 psi pressure and cause most of it to fly under the wing, increasing the pressure to say 11 psi, and less to go over the wing at maybe 9 psi, generating a net upward pressure of 2 psi and keeping the plane from falling out of the sky. We do the reverse for a spoiler on a car to push it down so it can maintain contact with the road. But there's no air, no pressure in the chamber with the plates. It's genuinely negative pressure, a lower pressure than nothing. Well, there is an energy associated to normal pressure. All those particles flying around whacking things have kinetic energy, temperature, mass. They have positive energy. So to have negative pressure, you need negative energy, less than 0. Now, negative energy isn't quite the same as negative mass, but functionally, it can probably be used as a substitute, and it's not a bad indicator that negative mass particles might exist or could be created, or that those negative matter struts in the Visser wormhole might simply be charged up with negative energy, for instance, or charged down, I suppose. Okay, topic 10, naked singularities. One of the problems with black holes, of course, is that all the neat stuff is going on beneath the event horizon. A naked singularity doesn't have this. The original notion being that if I spun a dense chunk of matter fast enough, it would form into a ring, exposing the singularity. This violates the cosmic censorship hypothesis Roger Penrose came up in 1969, which argues that if you saw a naked singularity, reality would break down. Well, causality would break down, but honestly that amounts to the same thing. Of course, it explicitly excludes the Big Bang, which gets exempted from a lot of things. I think people forget sometimes that there were some very solid objections to the Big Bang Theory when it first got proposed that stuck around for a long time, and its blatant violation of thermodynamics was just one of them. History often makes out such debates as being wise visionaries versus stubborn old cranks or irrational lunatics, but usually that's not how it was. Not that there is ever a shortage of old cranks and lunatics, or a surplus of wise visionaries, they just tend to be more evenly distributed. If naked singularities did exist and didn't violate causality, it would in principle make some types of wormholes a lot easier to make. It's also an option under loop quantum gravity, which has gotten to be a popular area of research and theory in the last few decades. Topic 11. Quantum entanglement and wormholes. Back in episode 1, I discussed quantum entanglement and some misconceptions about it. One of the folks commented on me leaving out ER equals EPR, and I told him I was saving it for a look at wormholes. This is one of Leonard Susskind's more recent ideas, and in a nutshell suggests that entangled particles are actually connected by non-traversable wormholes. This doesn't actually change anything we discussed in that episode, but I wanted to wait till we had discussed traversable versus non-traversable wormholes to bring it up. Since they're non-traversable, the ER standing for Einstein-Rosen bridge, which we already mentioned weren't traversable, you still can't use entangled particles to send information faster than light. Personally, I love the idea. The notion of little Planck-scale wormholes connecting two entangled particles that breaks when they cease being entangled is just neat. No idea if it's true, but it's gotten pretty popular and I think it deserves mention. It's a very elegant solution, and I always like those in science. Topic 12. Time travel in wormholes. Not time travel with wormholes, that in a bit, but a question that comes up sometimes is how long it takes to travel through one and if it's instant. It isn't, though it kinda depends on when you are officially beginning the wormhole. Wormholes are sometimes classified by basically how horribly deadly the trip would be, and traversable ones are usually labeled as benign. There's also absurdly benign, which the Visser wormhole usually qualifies as. In the context of spherically symmetric wormholes, you've got to drop down through the mouth, down the throat, and out through the other mouth. That does take actual time, and as I mentioned earlier, your time is very slowed down. It doesn't really have anything to do with the distance between the two mouths in real space though. I've seen some calculations that worked out to be about a second for the absurdly benign and small Visser wormhole, and the better part of a year for the bigger Thorne or Ellis wormhole, but I never duplicated them or checked if that was internal time for the passenger or time passed in the external universe. Again, time slows down inside a black hole, and I suppose it technically wouldn't matter as we'll see in a moment, but so much focus is put on using these things as time machines that very little gets put on the time spent inside one. If it took you centuries, for instance, in external time, to get through one, it's a bit dubious if it's all that advantageous to have them for anything not light centuries or further apart. Okay, topic 13, time travel and wormholes. We already covered all the weird temporal paradox stuff back in episode 2, so I'm just going to explain how that happens with a wormhole, and why it presumably doesn't matter how long it takes you to go through one in external time, just your own subjective time. As we know from special relativity, if I take an object up to high speeds, time slows down for it. So if I take off in a spaceship and fly out at near the speed of light, and loop around and come home a century later, I might only have experienced a few years myself. So we make a wormhole, stick one mouth in orbit around Earth, and fly the other off at relativistic speeds somewhere. The tug ship with its wormhole leaves in, say, the year 2200. So far this isn't a big deal. But as they're almost there, traveling at near the speed of light but not quite at it, a message catches up saying the deal's off, the colony representative on Earth cancel the order and to bring it back. Now when they turn around and loop home, it's been a century back on Earth. It's the year 2300, but only a few years have passed for them. The clocks at the mouth of the wormholes are synchronized, so at the mouth that stayed at Earth it's a century forward in time, but on a spaceship only a few years have passed. The crew is fine. They haven't only aged a few years, but they haven't traveled in time. But when an inspector checking the stabilizing element of the wormhole slips and falls through, he's spewed out in the year 2203. Now hypothetically, you could move both ends of a wormhole to keep them synchronized, but the big thing is that one mouth is back in time from the other if you don't, so jumping through sends you back in time. This is, ultimately, the biggest black mark against wormholes, because it seems unavoidable that you could use them as time machines, and the general feeling is that time travel has to be impossible. Of course, this only applies to intra-universe, traversable wormholes, one-way or two-way. If they exit out into another universe, or you can't send information through them, then cause and effect, causality, is safe. Though you almost invariably would get massive wormholes that went back in time, this doesn't necessarily result in violating causality. It's when you get them close that it does. For instance, if I've got one that's 50 years back in time, but 100 light years away, a message sent from it like warn President Kennedy not to go to Texas still takes 100 years to arrive and thus gets there 50 years later. You have to worry about link-ups of many wormholes though, in what's called a Roman ring, allowing for causality violations, though you can also avoid them by configuring your ring correctly too. Okay, let's move on to our last topic, other uses of wormholes, as well as some popular suggested uses that might not work. And if I don't say otherwise, assume I'm talking about an intra-universe two-way traversable one. A lot of times with wormholes in fiction, someone will suggest you could make a perpetual motion machine by opening a gate near the ground and the other end up in the air and just dropping a ball into the lower mouth. It comes out of the top, falling down, picking up speed, goes in again, pops back out near the top, getting faster and faster on each drop. Now in practice, it actually wouldn't because of air friction stopping the acceleration at terminal velocity, but you could just put a water wheel between the two mouths and dump water through, and harvest power. But under general relativity, this won't work. The ball or water falling through the lower wormhole will actually do work passing through it and lose kinetic energy gained. The traverse through the wormhole is effectively back up again. You might fall down the first mouth into the throat, but you have to spend energy getting back up out of the throat and the other mouth, and it will always match whatever the change in potential energy was. So this doesn't work, at least in models consistent with general relativity. However, using them as power sources is still quite doable. I mentioned in the terraforming video how much easier wormholes, if they exist, make terraforming planets. You could, for instance, hang one in a 24-hour orbit around your planet and dump the other end as close to your sun, or even in the sun, as your mouth and stabilizing equipment can handle without being destroyed. Bang, mini-sun. You could do the same and exit out into some water inside a steam engine turning turbines too. Bang, free power. Or kinda free anyway, the sun is just footing the bill. Ditto in the backside of a rocket ship, so the exit mouth is just spewing out hot plasma from the star and pushing you along. We almost always picture these as being in space, but that isn't necessarily required. One thing I liked about Stargate was them being on the ground in modern times. Peter Hamilton's Commonwealth Saga, one of my favorite sci-fi series, has them on planets with the novel inclusion of running trains through them from ward to ward and power supplies too. So you can put all your nuclear reactors on some worthless rock of a planet, for instance, and run superconducting cables out through the gates of the worlds. Of course, you can use them to bulk transport matter too, sucking air off one world to terraform another, even sucking mass in or out to alter the gravity. Though it's worth remembering that any mass going into one slightly disrupts it, and putting through mass equal to the wormhole should make it explode. When you're trickling it through over long time periods, you can presumably stabilize it continuously. But opening one up to suck a planet through is not going to work in most models unless the mass of the wormholes is way, way larger. Which of course it would be if it had a throat the size of a planet. Remember, the Visser wormhole's mouth is only a meter across and it needs a whole Jupiter worth of exotic matter alone to create it. Now for the inter-universe wormholes, this is maybe useful too, since you could open one up to a hotter, younger universe, maybe, or a colder one, getting heat or mass from the former, though they are usually one way and you expect to be on the outgoing end of the tunnel. But they could be two-way or let you be on the incoming end. It's a nice cheat for entropy. But if you could traverse one, you could still cheat by just jumping into a young or fresh universe, probably. Of course, they make awesome weapons too, especially if you can open them wherever you please as small as you like, letting you for instance open up a tiny one to look through, then opening up another one in front of a machine gun and let the bullets fly through targeted by the wormhole. Upscaled, you could send huge laser blasts like those we discussed in the Nikon Dyson beam video out wherever you pleased. You could open one up just inside another ship too, since it would cut right through the armored defenses. Again, these aren't passing through space in a straight line. The flip side would be defense, since you could open wormholes up a decent distance from your planet or ship and get early warning of even laser beams coming in, and potentially precision open one in front of it that exited away from your ship or planet. This, of course, assumes you can control where they open. Currently, to get a wormhole where you want requires either making both ends near each other and dragging them where you like, or opening one, figuring out where it exited, and collapsing it if it doesn't get you closer to your destination, and restabilizing it again, and then probably towing it to a precise location anyway. But even if you can't control the destination at all, and it pops up randomly anywhere in the universe, even outside the observable universe, you can just keep reopening it till it's close to some place that looks like a nice candidate for colonization, and then stabilize it there. This would have the amusing effect of meaning the closest colonies to Earth, in terms of transit time, might be 1 billion light years away, and you might need to pass through hundreds of gates each billions of light years from each other to get to a star system only 100 light years away. A common suggested use is just for communication, very tiny wormholes just big enough to allow a signal through. An obvious continuation of this notion is including them in very large computers to allow you to avoid signal lag. This has the problem though of bottlenecking, depending on how much energy it costs to maintain a wormhole, how small you can make them, and how much energy and time is spent putting each photon through. Wormholes aren't free. They take a lot of material to make, take time to pass through, and require maintenance to keep them stable. So if they exist, and can be made small, there would still be a point of diminishing returns, whether that is so small you could use them between each processor, or so big only full-blown Matryoshka brains, wired up to twins in other solar systems would benefit from it, is impossible to say yet. But we've talked a lot about heat a lot recently, as the big constraint on a lot of our projects like maximizing calculations or building huge planet-sprawling supercities, Euclid-monopolises. Wormholes presumably let you cheat at that too. You could use them as a massive air conditioning system for a planet that you dumped heat through and supercharge that by having another connecting to places that were very cold. It would probably take a lot of juice to make and maintain that and pump the heat, but you could probably make it a net positive system to cool a planet where you were grabbing huge amounts of power to run it way beyond what you should be able to do without boiling the place. Of course, if you've got easy access to exotic matter, negative mass, that could be very handy constructing oversized buildings that ought to collapse under their own mass too. I mentioned in the Euclid-monopolis video that the big brother of a planet-wide city would be a multi-layered one, or even what I dubbed a planet cloud, sort of a mini Dyson swarm around a planet, and wormholes would make building one and running it, far more energetically, a lot easier. But very small and cheap wormholes arguably make one redundant anyway. If you can make them easily and put them where you want, even a Dyson swarm for habitation gets a bit redundant, since you can make a small one for just sucking up power from a star and transport that wherever you want. While folks could have a house inside an asteroid in another part of the galaxy and just step through to Earth, or even have a house with rooms on different planets, or in different universes if you could make two-way inter-universe wormholes. That notion got played with a bit in Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos, houses with rooms on different planets. And the idea of houses with rooms in a different universe gets played with in one of the later books in Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber. Pretty neat concept as an extension of our modern one of the internet and cloud computing, where the physical location of your files might be on the other side of the planet, but right at your fingertips. I'm not sure how practical it would be, but it would be kinda awesome to have a closet in your apartment that opened up to a huge walk-in closet among millions in some huge warehouse on another planet, or a balcony in your bedroom that opened up to some terraced vista on another world. So some fun food for thought to close things out. I regret we couldn't get into the math, and I hate to say that like all the other concepts we've discussed in this series for getting around the speed of light, I don't think this one will pan out. But it's probably the most promising of options, and I'd love to be proved wrong. Next week we're going to take a look at Tabby's star, the candidate system folks have been suggesting might be a Dyson sphere or other megastructure. And we'll talk about SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And I'm going to talk about some of the methods, some of the proposed methods, and some of the difficulties with them. In general channel news, we're still finishing up a variety of projects, and that shouldn't be much longer. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for alerts for new videos and channel news. As always, questions and comments are welcome. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and share it with others. If you want to help support the channel, you can find the link to Patreon in the video description, and you can try out any of these video series. Until next time, thanks for watching, and have a great day.